If you were to ask me to build the perfect pro wrestler, I'm talking based on physical appearance. Sid Eudy is what he would look like. 6'9", 300 pounds, big, tall, intimidating guy, even with the little orphan Annie curly hair. Maybe the best look for any pro wrestler that I've ever seen. You would look at the guy and think, how could he not be one of the biggest stars in the history of the business? Another wrestler from the era that I grew up on, gone too soon. Sid went by a lot of names in his career. Lord Humongous when he was first starting out. Sid Vicious is the name that he got the most mileage out of. Sid Justice. And Sycho Sid. His son Gunner broke the news in a post on Facebook that his father passed away at the age of 63 after battling cancer for several years. He said he was known as Sycho Sid Vicious to the world, but to our family, he was simply Popper, the beloved grandfather. Sid was diagnosed with congestive heart failure in 2016 and atrial fibrillation, better known as AFib, around the same time. He was also given a pacemaker. In April 2021, he was diagnosed with stage 4 non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, which was linked to Roundup weed killer. Although he never told anybody about his fight against cancer, he lived his life to the fullest, attending the gym, boxing classes, making appearances for his fans, and of course, t-ball games for the kids. He passed away peacefully in his bed, leaving behind a legacy of strength and determination. I've never met anybody with a fraction of the strength as my father. He truly was one of a kind. Sid was still out making appearances just a few weeks ago. He was in Charlotte at the Gathering, taking pictures and signing autographs. He wasn't just battling stage 4 cancer. He apparently had gotten COVID as well. That's what Bobby Fulton tweeted out, one half of the Fantastics. He was the master of the powerbomb. 2-time WWE World Champion, 2-time WCW World Champion, and 2-time WrestleMania headliner. Those were his only WrestleMania matches, and he headlined both shows. I got the chance to meet him once in late 96. He was champion the first time. I'll never forget when he pulled that Winged Eagle belt out of that black velvet bag. I was so mad. We didn't have a camera with us. I did get his autograph, but I didn't get any photos. Sid was actually studying to become a pilot before he got into wrestling. His father was a pilot, taught him how to fly. He was going to be a crop duster at the farm that he was working at in Arkansas. When he had a chance meeting with Randy Savage at a gym. That would have been when Savage was working the Memphis territory. Savage and a bunch of other wrestlers, they were in the gym. They took one look at him and they asked him, they go, "Hey, dude, you ever think about getting into wrestling?" Because like I said before, you take one look at this guy. He looks like a pro wrestler. And Sid hadn't watched wrestling since he was a little kid. But his wife was pregnant at the time, I think with their second child. And he thought, well, it's a way for me to make money. So that's how he got into the business. He has admitted in interviews that he didn't, get into it because he had a love for the business or because he was such a big fan as a kid. He really just got into it to make money. And I think fans sometimes shit on people for that. Like Bill Goldberg has talked about that, how he got hurt playing football and his accountant was on him. Like, you gotta get out there. You gotta make money somehow. And so he got into wrestling. He never had a passion for it the way that a lot of other people do. And he gets shit on for that, by some people. There's a lot of reasons you could shit on Goldberg. That's not one of them, though. I've never understood that. It's a job. Like, not everybody is cut out to be a wrestler, but others have certain physical gifts or they have an aptitude for it and they end up becoming big stars and very successful and making millions of dollars. Being a wrestling fan is not a prerequisite for becoming a professional wrestler. I would dare say some of the biggest legends of the business from when I grew up, and probably many of you grew up, right? The men that got me into wrestling probably did not grow up as wrestling fans. They were probably bouncing at a bar somewhere or they were playing some other sport. And like Sid, they got noticed at the gym. Nothing wrong with that. I think that's why you hear about guys like Sid who bounced around different territories for different reasons. They did so, at least in part, because it was just a business to them. They were able to divorce themselves from that whole aspect. Guys kind of mark out or they're like, oh, I always wanted to work for WWE. And, they're willing to eat a lot of shit because this is their dream job and this is where they always wanted to be. But, a guy like Sid, he didn't worry about any of that stuff. It's just a business to them. They weren't marks for it the way that a lot of other people are. They weren't marks for the promoter, Vince McMahon or whoever. They could play their Jedi mind tricks on them and get what they want out of these people. When you're unhappy at your job, what do? You quit and you go work somewhere else. So Memphis is where he got his start as Lord Humongous, and then it was on to WCW after that for his run with Danny Spivey. They were a tag team called the Skyscrapers. Before that, though, little side story that I always found very fascinating. Sid was one of two names that Antonio Inoki considered for the Big Van Vader gimmick before it ultimately went to Leon White. Inoki actually wanted Jim Hellwig to play Vader, which I just can't even picture that. But that fell through. Jim went to WWE as the Ultimate Warrior, and so his second choice was Sid. Now imagine Sid in New Japan walking around in that giant helmet. So Leon ended up getting the role instead, which is what made his entire career. And Sid ended up in WCW. He joined the Four Horsemen for a while. I shit you not. He joined the Four Horsemen to handle RoboCop. Yes, RoboCop was brought in as an ally of Sting's, and the very first promo that Sid ever cut as a member of the Horsemen, because I've been going back all this week on YouTube and Peacock and just kind of rewatching the hits and the not-so hits from Sid's career, just kind of going down that rabbit hole. The very first promo Sid ever cut as a member of the Horsemen, he's out there in a tuxedo. He is towering over everybody, and he is cutting a promo on RoboCop. I love wrestling. The goofiest shit in the world, and I absolutely love it. Then he went on to challenge Sting for the World Heavyweight title. That was in 1990. This all happened in a relatively short period of time. I would say from the time he came into the NWA to the time he wrestled Sting for the world title, I don't even think it was 18 months. That's how over he got and how hard he was pushed in a relatively short period of time. In 91, he gave notice to WCW that he was leaving to go work for Vince McMahon. And they did everything they could to try to keep him. They gave him a big pay raise for guaranteed money and a promise of a world championship run, and he still left. He was lured over by the promise of a WrestleMania main event with Hulk Hogan, which he probably knew, hey, that can make me a lot more money, even though I'm probably going to lose. So he left guaranteed money on the table in one company to go lose to Hulk Hogan in the other. Now, Vince had no idea at the time that Ric Flair would suddenly become available a few months later. So when you wonder why Vince never went with the obvious Hogan-Flair main event at WrestleMania in 92, I mean, yeah, they claimed the house show business they did wasn't great, and they feared it wasn't going to draw as a WrestleMania match. The biggest reason, though, may have been that Sid was promised that match from the moment he signed. Right? I don't know that he got it in writing. I mean, it's not like Vince McMahon hasn't promised things to people before and broken those promises, but if Sid came in with the promise of a match with Hogan, then those plans would have been in the works well before the show, regardless of Ric Flair coming in. Hogan versus Sid, when you think about it though, Hogan versus Sid, honestly, was also much more of a WWF style match than Hogan versus Flair. I mean, again, you just look at Sid, you could see why Vince would have had dollar signs in his eyes. Because remember, we were still in the era of the big man in that company at that point. 92 is where that first started to change with all the heat on them from the government, but it was still very much a big man territory up until that year. But he said that not taking the deal the WCW offered him and choosing to go to WWE instead, that was the biggest mistake he ever made. Because Vince had told him, you'll make more for WrestleMania than you will for an entire year working in WCW. He claims WCW was offering him $750,000 a year. I don't know how true that is, but he said he made $150,000 for that WrestleMania. So in his eyes, it ended up being a big mistake. But he didn't know that at the time, and so off he went. And they brought him in as Sid Justice. He was playing a babyface. He was the special referee for the match made in hell at SummerSlam that year, with Hogan and the Ultimate Warrior against Sergeant Slaughter, Colonel Mustafa, and General Adnan. That was the night that Vince either fired the Warrior backstage at the Garden when he got back through the curtain or suspended him, depending on who you believe. I think it was a suspension, at least initially. But either way, we didn't see him again until WrestleMania the following year. That whole period is so fascinating to me because heading into that SummerSlam in 91, the clear direction was Jake the Snake Roberts against the Ultimate Warrior. And I'm not even saying it would have been the SummerSlam match, but they had started airing this whole series of vignettes on TV with Jake teaching Warrior about the dark side. And Jake's entire life was the dark side. But that was the plan, for the two of them to feud until Warrior got fired or suspended or whatever. Had it happened, we likely never get the Randy Savage Jake the Snake feud, which is my all-time favorite short feud. So instead, they shoot the wedding reception angle with the Snake popping out of the gift box and spooking Elizabeth, and then Jake and The Undertaker attack Randy Savage until Sid steps in to save the day and try to defend him. The plan then was for Sid to feud with Jake, with Sid taking Warrior's spot. And they even advertised the Team Justice against Team Roberts match for Survivor Series that year. But then Sid tore his bicep, and he was out for a few months. That then opened the door for a Macho Man return, because he had been retired. He lost that career-ending match to the Warrior at WrestleMania 7. He was doing commentary every week. Now, do I think he would have stayed retired? Of course not. But that's why he was rushed back for the program with Jake. So were it not for a series of unfortunate circumstances, things would have looked very different that fall, heading into WrestleMania. But it was during this period, right after he suffered the arm injury, that there was an infamous incident that took place. There were multiple incidents with Sid over the years, but the infamous Squeegee Incident took place right around this time. It's a great story. I've covered it before here on the podcast many years ago. WCW had a house show at the Omni in Atlanta. And it just so happened that the WWF crew had a show scheduled for the Omni the following night. So you had wrestlers from both companies that were in town at the same time, probably staying at the same hotel. And so they got together at the hotel bar. And Dave Penzer actually talked about this in his new book that just came out. He was the ring announcer for WCW. He said Sid walked into the bar and he started bragging about how much more money he was making working for Vince and how I'm going to headline WrestleMania and WCW sucks and all this, it's a country bumpkin promotion and all this stuff. As the story goes, Mike Graham, who was working for WCW at the time, he asked Sid, he goes, "Why are you here?" And Sid said to him, "You guys suck." Now Mike Graham, not known to be the calmest person in the world. He was known to be a hothead. He allegedly called Sid a steroid freak, said, "You can't work worth a shit. You'll never draw a fucking dime," which is funny coming from Mike Graham. But he told him, "Take your money, go home and play some fucking softball." Because Sid famously loved to play softball. He would disappear for months at a time and you would wonder, where's Sid? Oh, he's probably home playing softball. That's where softball Sid comes from. So this happens. Brian Pillman, he was there too. He was working for WCW. He may have also said something to Sid. They may have gotten into some words. He and Sid did not like each other. Sid hurt him in the War Games match earlier that year when he powerbombed him. The cage roof was so low. So when he brought Pillman down, he brought him down in such a way right on the back of his neck. He's lucky he didn't break his neck. I think Pillman only missed a few weeks, but he's very lucky he didn't suffer a more serious injury. Sid, by the way, claims he did that on purpose. He says that wasn't an accident. You would watch it and think, oh, it was an accident. Sid says it wasn't an accident. He says because what happened was there was a show not long before that. Pillman, I guess it was a house show. Pillman was whining to the agent about having to take his finish because all the guys complained whenever they worked with Sid in the Northeast because he would get cheered. This is what Sid claims. So I guess Pillman whining about it rubbed him the wrong way. And so a month later, he intentionally tried to fucking break his neck on the powerbomb. So anyway, no love lost there. Sid leaves the bar. He goes out to his car because he's got a torn bicep and he's not about to fight these guys. So he grabs the first thing that he sees, a squeegee. He comes back into the bar holding a fucking squeegee like it's a Smith & Wesson. Come on, motherfuckers, I'll kick all your asses. Penzer says everybody just paused for a second, and then they all just busted out laughing. He said Sid could not get out of that bar fast enough. So that's where the Squeegee Sid name comes from. Then came the greatest Royal Rumble match of all time in 1992. The pop that Sid got that night in Albany when he dumped Hulk Hogan out of the ring and eliminated him was deafening. And the crowd booed Hogan loudly when he helped Flair dump Sid out of the ring. You would never know any of this if you watched the replay that they aired on Saturday Night's Main Event a few weeks later, because they dubbed the audio out. They dubbed out all the cheers for Sid. They dubbed in boos. They had Monsoon and Heenan lay down a new commentary track attacking Sid. How could he, do this? He stabbed Hogan in the back, at least looked the man in the face. And even then, like, I'm a younger fan at that time. I mean, I'm not, super young, but I'm young enough. And I'm watching this and I'm like, it's every man for himself. What's he talking about? What's the problem here? I fail to see what the problem is. Like, how is Sid supposed to be the heel when Hogan just helped Ric Flair win the championship? That I'll never know. But that's what he was supposed to be, even though the fans weren't buying it. Even after the match. Hogan and Sid, they came, face to face. And the fans chanted for Sid. They chanted his name. Hogan looked shook. I'll never forget the look on Hogan's face. The man looked shook. And that wasn't even the first time that Hogan got a negative reaction. That was Survivor Series 2 months before this. When Undertaker pinned him and won the title, it got a noticeably positive reaction. Which is not to say that Hogan was booed everywhere he went, but, people were getting tired of the shtick. They were growing tired of the same red and yellow, eat your vitamins, say your prayer stuff that they had been watching for years. Sid represented something new, and he just was a cool guy. But the plan was always for Hogan to wrestle Sid, even though they teased Hogan and Flair on TV. That was never the plan. Sid main evented WrestleMania with Hogan. He became the first man to ever kick out of the leg drop, even though it wasn't supposed to happen. Harvey Whippleman, who was managing Sid at that time, he was supposed to break up the pinfall, but he was late in doing so. So was Papa Shango. He was supposed to run in on the match. I don't know if it was supposed to be on that spot, but he got a late cue, and so he was still all the way down the aisle walking to the ring in this big stadium when all this stuff was going down. Now, there's two versions as to why Sid left the company in 92, because it was always a very weird thing the way he just sort of up and vanished. The belief has always been that he failed a drug test before WrestleMania. And they let him work the show because he was in the main event. They let him work the show, and they let him work the subsequent European tour. Because back then, they always had a European tour coming out of WrestleMania. And then the idea was that he would be suspended for a certain period of time. The last show he worked was in Boston against the Ultimate Warrior. And this is why it's so weird. If he failed a drug test, let's say in March or early April, and he was suspended, they let him work almost another full month. And the last show he worked wasn't even overseas. It was in Boston against the Warrior. Now, as Sid tells the story, he never failed a drug test. He's always maintained, nope, that's not true. I never failed a drug test. He said that it was over a disagreement with the Ultimate Warrior, where in the back before the show, and they worked a few nights, I don't remember which show it was, but before their match on one of the shows, they're in the locker room, and the Warrior told Sid, look, you're going to hit me with your finish, and I'm going to kick out of it, and then I'm going to beat you. Which is what he did to Triple H at WrestleMania 12, although Triple H was a nobody at that point. But this is Sid. Sid had just wrestled in the main event of WrestleMania. Sid was hardly a nobody. So Sid didn't like that, and he worked the match, and then he stormed out of the building. And that was the last anyone saw of him during that first run in WWE. So he showed up again the following year. He was probably under a non-compete. He showed up a year later in WCW, which is when he brought Booker T and Stevie Ray in from Global. Sid had worked there for a while in between stints, which is where he first laid eyes on Harlem Heat. And Booker has always been very open about how much he is appreciative for Sid, for what he did for him and his brother. He got Harlem Heat their first big break. He even let them stay at his apartment during that time. Sid was scheduled to beat Vader at Starrcade in 93 to win the WCW Championship. He was going to be their top new babyface. And that never happened. And the reason it never happened is because of one of the more infamous incidents in wrestling history. It was October 27th, 1993, at the end of the first night of a WCW European tour in the UK. Sid was at the hotel bar, as was Arn Anderson, and Sid made a comment about why he felt the company wasn't drawing. That it was because of old guys like Ric Flair, they won't step aside. Arn's version is that Sid was bragging about holding up WCW for a big raise and that all these quote-unquote old fuckers need to retire. Meanwhile, Arn had just taken a $100,000 pay cut under Bill Watts the year before. And here's Sid talking, gloating and talking about how he held him up to get an extra $100,000. So now Arn knows where that $100K went. So the two of them had words, and either Arn threw a beer at Sid's face or Sid threw a beer at Arn's face. Everybody got sent back to their rooms. Doug Dillinger was the head of security for WCW for many years. He was there. He intervened. Everybody went back to their rooms. Too Cold Scorpio, he went back to his room to go smoke some hash, as he tells the story. All of a sudden, he hears a commotion. Now, he's thinking it's Vader. Vader, though, is sleeping. So he goes downstairs. They were so loud. Whatever was going on was so loud, he could hear them one floor below. So he goes down one flight, gets in the hallway. He finds the hallway, the walls of the hallway and the floor covered in blood. It was like something out of a horror movie. And he looks and he sees Sid standing over Arn Anderson. Both of them are covered in blood. And Sid has a pair of scissors in his hand. So Too Cold rushes over to get in between them. He's a braver man than I would have been if I saw Sid standing there covered in blood with a sharp object in his hands. Sid looks down. He sees a hole in his stomach. Blood is squirting out of it. Now, by this point, Vader has been awoken from his slumber. He finally wakes up. He comes out of his room, nothing but his tighty-whities. There's a visual for you. And he finds Sid with blood pouring out of his stomach. So he does the only thing that he could think of. He takes his thumb and he sticks his thumb in the hole to stop the bleeding. Scorpio probably saved Arn Anderson's life. Vader probably saved Sid's, or else he would have bled out. Neither man pressed charges on the other. The police didn't charge either man since they were leaving the country anyway. Arn suffered 20 stab wounds with those scissors all over his body. Sid got stabbed 4 times. They were both lucky to be alive. All this over a stupid disagreement at the bar. I'm sure alcohol was involved. And this is what ended up happening. Sid got fired over the incident. He was on his way to a WCW title win. He was going to be the top guy. He got fired over the incident. He pissed away a $600,000 a year contract and a world championship run. Arn was not fired, although he was suspended. So that tells you who the company blamed for being the instigator here. And you would think, after an incident like that, and Arn was, even back then, I think Arn Anderson was pretty well liked and well respected. One of the boys, one of the veterans. You would think that after an incident like that, nobody would want to hire this guy again. Nobody would want to work with him. But WWE came calling eventually. You fast forward to 1995, because he was working, I think, in Memphis in the meantime. And USWA, he became their world champion. But in 95, Vince came calling and they brought him in to be Shawn Michaels' bodyguard. This was the beginning of the Sycho Sid run. He turned on Michaels the night after WrestleMania. He got a few championship matches with Diesel. He was supposed to challenge Shawn for the Intercontinental title at SummerSlam, but the card looked terrible. So they bumped the match to TV, and instead they booked another ladder match between Shawn and Razor, which I don't want to say it saved the show because it wasn't a good show, but it was easily the best thing on the show by about 15 country miles. Sid got a neck injury. He missed some time, many months actually, before WWE came calling again. Because the Ultimate Warrior in 96 got brought back to the company. You can imagine how that was going to work out. Didn't take much time at all. He flaked out on the company. They fired him, and they needed somebody to take his spot, and that man was Sid. And whatever it was about that run in 96, that's the run where fans went absolutely nuts for this guy. He was ridiculously over in the summer and fall of 1996. He was over like Rover. The original plan for Shawn was to drop the world title to Vader at Survivor Series. Shawn didn't want to work with him, so Sid got the spot instead, and at Madison Square Garden that night, Sid had what has to be considered the best match of his career. They were not expecting the crowd to react the way that they did, but they cheered wildly for Sid, and they booed the hell out of Shawn. So you mean to tell me that New York City didn't want to cheer the dancing pretty boy over the cool badass monster? The hell you say. That's what happened. They cheered when Sid won the title, even though minutes before he hit a senior citizen in the chest with a television camera, who was now on the ground twitching around, feigning a heart attack. And they still cheered this man. I remember Vladimir, the superfan in the front row, even leaned in to give him a big hug. He was so happy that Sid won. So he beat Bret Hart at the following In Your House pay-per-view. He dropped the belt back to Shawn at the Royal Rumble in San Antonio. He was scheduled to wrestle Shawn again on Raw the following month for the championship when Shawn famously lost his smile. And then he vacated the title. This was less than 6 weeks before WrestleMania that all of this happened. So the new plan was to put the title up at a four-way match, something we had never seen before. Triple threats and fatal four-ways just didn't happen back then. Not on TV, they didn't. Bret won the title, and then 24 hours later on Raw, he lost the belt back to Sid. And that's a whole other wild situation, the road to WrestleMania 13, because originally it was supposed to be a rematch that year with Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels, and Bret thought, okay, I'm going to be winning, because I put Shawn over the year before, now he's going to return the favor to me. Well, Shawn didn't want to lose, right? Because Shawn Michaels doesn't lay down for anybody. Then, all of a sudden, he comes down with a potentially career-ending knee injury. Aw. Crocodile tears and all. And so Vince is like, well, fuck this shit. I don't need the drama with these two small guys. I'm going to go back to my tried and true, which is the big boys. And we got The Undertaker and Sid in the main event of WrestleMania. But that also gave us Bret Hart against Steve Austin on the undercard, which is one of the greatest matches in the history of that company. So I think it worked out okay. Interesting little factoid, Sid is the only man to beat Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels to win world titles. And he had the best matches of his career with both of them. And Sid didn't do too much after that. He was gone a few months later. He was out. He got a pretty serious neck injury after a car accident on the road and needed neck surgery, I think. He ended up in ECW a couple of years later, and he was every bit as over there as he was everywhere else that he had ever been. The fans loved him. And Paul Heyman knew how to use him. He would show up unannounced, and he would just powerbomb a bunch of guys, and people would go nuts. His run there didn't last long. It was only a few months before he wound up back in WCW. Even with Arn Anderson working there, he ended up back in WCW, but they made amends. They were on good terms. They were cool with each other by this point, despite the attempted murder. Sid won the WCW title twice during that run. The thing I remember most was his feud with Bill Goldberg and the shot of him standing on top of his rental car, which had been crushed, I guess by Goldberg. He had used some kind of machine, and he had crushed Sid's car, flattened it into a pancake. And so Sid is standing on top of what's left of his car, screaming Goldberg's name, looking up at the heavens like, Goldberg! And like, why me? Why me? Like something out of a comedy film. The dying days of WCW basically was a comedy film. It was simultaneously a comedy and a tragedy. And then came the end of Sid's run, and the most horrific injury that I have ever witnessed in a wrestling ring. At the WCW Sin pay-per-view in January of 2001. It was a four corners match for the championship. Sid, Scott Steiner, Jeff Jarrett, and a mystery man who turned out to be Road Warrior Animal. Sid comes off the middle rope, which is something he never did. He was not someone who did moves off the ropes. But on this night he did, and when he landed, his leg snapped. He fractured his tibia. He fractured his fibula. I mean, I'm shuddering just sitting here talking about it because I don't even like going back and watching it. It's been years since I've seen it. It's just one of those injuries where you see it once and you wish you hadn't. Like, that's more than enough. And Sid has always blamed John Laurinaitis for making him do the spot. The idea was he would come off the middle rope and give Steiner a high knee. And Sid wasn't comfortable doing it. And he tried to get it changed. He voiced his feelings on it. And he claims that Laurinaitis insisted on him doing the spot. Basically, they were setting up a spot for Laurinaitis' brother. Because Johnny Ace and Road Warrior Animal were brothers. And Road Warrior Animal was going to be the mystery man in this match. And so Johnny wanted to set things up just right for his brother. He wanted everything to go just right. Meanwhile, this guy's leg snaps. His boot is flopping around. Ugh, God, it's just... And you know what's extra shitty about it? That injury effectively ended Sid's career. Like, he never worked for a national promotion again after that. Now, he was already in his 40s at that point. I don't know how much longer of a run he would have had. I don't know if he was completely healthy, if Vince would have even brought him back. You know, there are certain people Vince McMahon did not bring back, but I guarantee you if Vince McMahon did not bring him back to WWE after WCW folded, if we would have had a Sycho Sid run or a Sid Vicious run in TNA. Like that I guarantee you. So, but that injury was effectively it for his career. Now, he did eventually come back. He wrestled again years later. It took 3 or 4 years before he was back in the ring. He wrestled on the indies. I know he was hoping to get back to WWE. It never panned out. They did bring him back eventually for one match on Raw back in 2012. That was part of the build to Raw 1000. And he wrestled Heath Slater, and he won with the powerbomb. And that was it. Sid is the only man to have held the Winged Eagle belt from that era. Of all the guys who held it, and that belt was around for 10 years. The only man to hold that title who is not in the WWE Hall of Fame. That is insane. The last interview he ever did, shout out to the Attitude Era podcast. They were at a signing, and Sid was standing there, and they were able to grab him for about 5 minutes, and they did a little interview with him, and he said he thought with Vince McMahon being gone, now they would finally put him in the Hall of Fame. Because they still had him under a Legends deal. You know, his attitude was, they got me under a Legends contract, they're making money off of me. Maybe now they'll finally put me in the Hall of Fame. And now he's gone. No one is ever going to mistake Sid Vicious for being the best in-ring worker or having the best matches. He wasn't, and he didn't. And I say that as a fan of his. That's not what got him over. It was his look. It was his charisma. That's what made him so intimidating as a heel, but also made him so easy to cheer for as a babyface. You know, the guy looked like a badass. And his legacy is that wherever he went, he got over. In the NWA, when he would be on TV killing job guys, the people cheered. His first run in WWE, even when they were not supposed to be, the people cheered. When he went back to WCW in 93, the people went nuts for him. When he came back in 95 and he powerbombed Shawn Michaels, go look at that crowd. They cheered him. Comes back in 96, they cheered him. Goes to ECW, they lost their minds over him. Goes back to WCW, same old song. That's his legacy. That and him telling Kevin Nash on Nitro that he's got half the brain that Nash does. That's just one of those moments that you can't ever live that down. But over the past few years, you didn't really hear much about Sid. Every now and then I would come across, like on Facebook, there'd be some photos of him with his grandkids. He always looked happy, which is what makes this so sad. He seemed to be enjoying being a grandfather. At 63 years old, he didn't have nearly enough time to enjoy his golden years. I know a lot of his peers from that era never even made it into their 50s, let alone their 60s. So he's lucky in that regard. But it's still sad that he didn't get to enjoy more time as Sid the Family Man.